Hello and welcome to Flow by Design, a podcast series brought to you by Project4 Learning Lab. In the previous episode, Project4 CEO Keith Howells joined me to provide an overview of the key flows in organisations that you will learn more about throughout this series, as well as the enablers that allow flow to occur effectively. In this episode, I have the joy of being joined once again by Keith, where we continue to explore those flows and enablers, but with a view on friction and how we can recognise, diagnose, and reduce friction in organisations.
Not often people say it's a joy, so thank you, Tom. Appreciate that. There are typical challenges. There are always new and unique ways to find challenge, but there are typical challenges. So priority pinball would be one of my favorites. So the continual switching of prioritization, not because the environment is inherently unstable, but because the misalignment between stakeholders in the organization means that people jump around from one priority to another. And that obviously drives context switching. And if there's one thing we know about humans, it's when you ask them to think about one thing and then start thinking about another, there's a tax to that. It takes a while to stop thinking about that thing, and it takes a while to get up to speed with something else. So that's a big productivity killer, massive.
It is. And it goes without saying, but the more things you have to do at once, the more ineffective you're going to be.
Totally, which leads to waiting waste. You know, the more things at once, the more time something's waiting, and the more you have to switch between one another, the slower things go, the more capacity. So yeah, there are a couple. I think the other one, I was going to say the other one I see a lot, which is ironic because it's flow fog. We don't know what the state of the work is because we're not measuring the work and whether it's flowing from requested to done. And I see many organizations managing spreadsheets of load and capacity, breaking things down into task level and trying to convince themselves that they've got enough people to do all the tasks. But much better to look at, is the work moving? And flow fog is something that I think many organizations are challenged with.
What would be a way of recognising flow fog?
Look out for the spreadsheets, definitely. Look out for really slow pace of output. So if you've got lots of frustrated stakeholders waiting for stuff or complaining about stuff, or loads of meetings going on to try and establish the status of work, then it's a fair bet that you've got flow fog. And the less clear the work is, the more status reviews you're going to have, the less time you've got to spend on moving the work, and the more time you've got to spend on justifying the work. So look out for those meetings where you're justifying what's not happening.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the S word, spreadsheets.
The expert.
Someone who has been buried in spreadsheets in the past, it's very easy to get bogged down in that, I think. And sometimes the spreadsheets are the solution, which they shouldn't be, I think. And it becomes a point where it's no longer a single source of truth, for example. It's strange now thinking about it, but it's been years since I've been buried in a spreadsheet. And it's been trying to get out of that to be, simple, more visible with the work that everyone can access at once. If someone's changing, it's a live system that doesn't have multiple save versions as well. So yeah, I know people will be hooked onto that because a lot of people are in spreadsheets, I think.
I had 25 years of it, of spreadsheets, because trained as an engineer, you've got to have a spreadsheet. And the great thing about spreadsheets is they can do anything and show anything to a point. I mean, I was going to say my name's Keith and it's been 8 years since I used my last spreadsheet, but maybe that's overstating the point. But it's easy to get in a cycle where you think you can model everything and ultimately you think you can get load and capacity to balance. But the truth is the estimate of load's wrong and the estimate of available capacity is wrong as well. And so much better to look at whether the work's flowing.
Yeah. A really key indicators of sort of stagnant knowledge flow in that sense, and trying to figure the what could we do to enable that knowledge flow. What the key things we could look at to get out of that.
I think there are some steps. So come from the Kanban method, which I think are really helpful steps of visualize the workflow. So what are the stages that work needs to go through from someone's asked for it to done? Then the hard step, the step that feels so non-intuitive, the limit work in progress. So reduce the opportunity for context switching, drive the need to prioritize by limiting work in progress. Manage flow. So now look at the conditions that under which flow can happen. So is the rate of departures exceeding the rate of arrivals? If more work's going out of the system than going in, then WIP's going to reduce. If they're balanced, then WIP's going to stay level. If the rate of arrivals is higher than the rate of departures from that workflow, then the cycle time is going to increase, and it's symptomatic of there's either a problem with capacity or there's some problem inside the process that needs to be addressed.
We reflected on it in the last episode as well of that desired effect in organization of maximizing capacity or utilization of capacity. And that then becomes the problem of maybe people will increase their work limits. Maybe people will have, bigger queues. Context switching goes up as well. And so it's trying to avoid all of that by, doing those things.
Yeah, massively. And I think many people, if it's not explicit, it's an implicit link of if we start this thing earlier, then it will finish earlier. And that's a real fallacy. So, yeah, it's probably going to slow itself and everything else that's in the process down. Being discerning and making those decisions is a challenge, right? It's a challenge. I think the other thing is to make what the method describes as make process policies explicit. And what it really means is define not just the definition of done, when is this thing done? What is the quality standard that needs to be met to say this thing's complete? But the definition of ready, when is this ready to enter the workflow, to be launched? And I see many organizations launching work before it's ready. And sometimes they'll say, well, let's launch this at risk. And it just disrupts everything. So being clear on what needs to be true for this to be ready and not launching stuff and then immediately putting it in a column that says waiting for inputs, which is symptomatic of the inputs weren't there to start. So being really clear and being clear on where to go when things are blocked or, routing problems so that work isn't blocked for long, routing those problems to the people who can sort them out.
It's a really good point, and we always say you need to stop starting and start finishing,
Yeah,
and at the same time avoid those false starts as well,
yeah,
because you just build that queue and you stop delivering to your customers on time, to your commitments, and then you get bogged down in this buildup of commitments, and it just snowballs, right? And then you really have to make some big decisions, and someone somewhere is going to become affected as a consequence.
yeah, yeah. If we're negotiating delivery after we've launched work, then definitely some stakeholders are going to be disappointed. If we negotiate likely delivery before we start work, then it's going to be a much less emotional discussion.
And genuinely, I think that's a one big tagline I would take away from this is that, particularly in knowledge flow,
Massive.
and it happens.
And then those two other states in the method that one is the feedback loops. So one of the benefits strands that we can get is to reduce rework and improve quality. And the best way to do that in anyone who's looked at quality management systems is to reduce the length of time between an error being made and the defect associated with that error being found. Because when that feedback loop is really short, then it gives us the chance to change something in our process to reduce the error rate and therefore the defect rate. When there's a big lag between I've done something wrong and it's found, I can keep thinking I'm doing really awesome work, and we don't improve. The quality doesn't get better over time. So feedback loops are our friend.
And our foes are massive surprises towards the end or towards a deadline.
Yes,
The last thing you want, right?
that's our big foe.
Yeah.
And the final bit, and it speaks to this strive for better, is the improve collaboratively. Yes, we might want to reduce handoffs. We might want to have a load of independence in moving work from requested to done, but it's normally not the reality of life. And most challenges are in the handoff, either the quality of communication or delays or lack of synchronization. So this idea of just having a cycle of improvement and where people can get together and say, how was that for us? Are we doing what we need to do? And explore in different ways.
It's really powerful. And sometimes, in my experience, I think leaders don't allow teams that time or don't openly give them permission to say, you have this time to focus on the improvements that you'll want to make in the next time box, for example, or have this explicit time where you're going to plan and you don't need to try and fit in your day to day activities at the same time because that happens. I think when people perceive they've got these planning rituals, that they can squeeze that in with their day to day, and you get ineffective planning, and you get surprises along the way, you get firefighting, and then you snowball again into a lot of the challenges and all the symptoms and challenges that we've already described in that.
And those granular guesswork, I'd call it, you can convince yourself that the more precise you are, the more correct it is. And the truth is, it's no more correct. And you've invested a load of time creating things that are wrong, and then get surprised later. And then, like you say, that squeezes the time for improvement. And the truth is, small improvements in the way teams work compound, i.e., they're present in the next cycle, the cycle after, the cycle after, the cycle after. So as an investment of time, it's the best investment anyone could possibly make. And yet it's the one that's used least frequently.
Shall we move on then to innovation flow? In my opinion, Keith, and I could be wrong in this, there are some similarities to maybe the challenges in innovation flow as there are in knowledge flow. Some of the things we've spoken about, I would sometimes associate with innovation as well, particularly around decision making.
Totally. And I think the key here is not to get too categorical in our thinking. I mean, we've provoked it by introducing these categories, but there's fluidity across these things. And many of the symptoms we'll see anywhere where you've got groups of people working together, which is every organization ever. Definitely a degree of similarity. Sometimes they show up differently. So just as we dig into some of the unique challenges of innovation flow, I think it's worth reflecting on what differentiates these types of work in the broadest spectrum. If we're talking about innovation flow, we're talking about research into product or service development to get to a point where it can be introduced into the market. And therefore, at the most extreme case, we haven't done it before, so we don't know what it is we need to do, and we don't know how long it's going to take, and we don't know the problems we're going to find. Whereas in knowledge flow, we might know how long it's going to take. We just don't know when the work's arriving, but we do know the steps we need to go through to get the work from requested to done. So we know more about the work, but we don't know so much about the conditions of the work. So if we look at innovation flow and decision making, like you said, Tom, then some of the challenges I see in this space a lot is an over reliance on process and process paralysis, by which I mean, while the process might say we've got this gated process that we need to go through to get to this point of maturity, and gated processes typically have a set of criteria and typically land in a presentation of some sort to a panel of people who decide whether the presentations that have been shown are of sufficient standard and quality to progress through the gate into the next phase. And it's easy to associate those things as decision-making forums, and they're absolutely not. And the reason why they can be so dangerous is because when you present to a panel and the panel asks questions, then what they're doing is exploring for gaps and understanding and trying to surface risk and trying to get to a point of clarity. What they're absolutely not doing is making decisions. And the greatest problem is the illusion that decisions are being made. And most gated reviews that I've been to land less in decisions and more in no one said it wasn't okay to progress. So you get these implicit things. So process paralysis is one. We get locked into process requirements rather than thinking about what are the decisions that need to be made to help us progress? Who's responsible for making them? What stops them making them today? And what work would be required at the lowest possible cost to give the highest accuracy answer to help them make a decision to move forward? And yeah, often absent in that space because it's hard.
Yeah. I've got experience in being in a project where there was a big emphasis on decision making early on in the program, and the similar methods being adopted, the ways of working in another program, but without that emphasis on the decision making. And the difference is stark. And the consequences of that, it flows down into an organization all the way to the team level, positive and negative consequences for both. As someone in a team, at the bottom of that, doing the work, if you see those decisions that need to be made, you can link the work that you're doing up to that. And it reduces that ambiguity and gives you focus on doing the right thing, as well as giving you that sense of purpose in a team. When you don't have those things at the top and it's not clear and it is ambiguous, the frustration flows down, and it can become a really difficult environment to work in because the dialogue's hard and the tension isn't healthy because you don't really know ultimately what you're working up towards. And having lived both of those, seeing that difference was really stark.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. It's a really interesting perspective, Tom. You made me think about the the way in which work is often handled in these environments not being appropriate. I.e., let's decompose work down into chunks and let's have some prioritization system that flows that priority down through those small chunks into teams. And that just doesn't work in this environment because the prioritization schema is generic as opposed to specific. So, if we said, well, how valuable is this thing? Then it's a subjective judgment. And if we then flow down value into small chunks, then if you're not careful, you end up with loads of small chunks of value that don't add up to de-risking the program as a whole or the product or the solution. So this idea of what are the outcomes we seek? What are the decisions that need to be made to achieve those outcomes? And what are the big uncertainties that if we get wrong are going to kill us? And where the big risks are in a program is because there's an A word, and the A word is assumption. So as soon as you hear someone in the innovation space say we're going to assume something, what they're saying is we don't know, but we need to know to make progress. Otherwise, we're going to stall. So we're going to assume this. And then they capture a whole assumptions log, which I would call a risk register, which is symptomatic of not planning to get the learning necessary so those assumptions aren't required. And sometimes things are outside your control and you do have to make assumptions. But the point at which you make an assumption and then do some work to turn that assumption into a fact, the quicker you can do that, the less exposed you are to risk and bad outcomes later.
Absolutely. in innovation flow, they're delivering complex things. Typically, it's stuff that's not been done before. And so when you're starting off at zero, you're going to have unknown unknowns. And the real quality comes in and the real value comes in from learning, because you're going to have a certain point in time where you know the decisions, or you think you know the right decisions you need to make, and the outputs you need to deliver to get there. But along that journey, you're going to learn, and you need to reflect on whether those decisions are the right ones still. And it's having that space to do that as well.
Yeah, it's not really possible to plan for the unknown unknowns. So what we need in this space is really good sensing systems. Can we sense at the extremities of our knowledge well to start to spot what might be lurking in the environment? And then can we turn that sensing into some meaning that causes us to adapt and react as a typically large teams, actually. So big products are typically large teams. So do we have the nimbleness or the agility, if you will, to adapt to new information that we're sensing that might cause us to rejig what we thought we needed to do in a particular time window? Difficult if those things aren't connected to outcomes and decisions and uncertainties. Other challenges, I guess, are we've talked about this. This is what we'd call activity anarchy, where our activities aren't related to uncertainty removal. They're not linked to learning anything. They're not linked to risk retirement. They're not linked to decisions. So we don't know if we're winning if the activities that we're doing aren't leading to better decision making. And finally, confidence chaos. So presenting dates and plans in the future with high degrees of confidence. We're gonna hit that concept review on this date. We're gonna enter into service on this date. We're gonna all these milestones along the way. The the people providing the estimates believe they need to provide certainty. The people receiving the estimates crave certainty. And so you've got this mutually reinforcing system of charades that is, I'll give you this plan this time, and we'll all conveniently forget that this plan is version 9, where we've slipped a load of dates before because no one said it was okay to reflect uncertainty in our forecast dates. So these funny patterns that go on in groups of people are really interesting to get underneath, I think.
It could become a big project habit as well if you start to go down that road.
Yeah, yeah.
It becomes acceptable to move stuff to the right without challenge or without understanding the consequence or the costs of delay as well. And without recognizing that, without putting action in to restore that, it's an easy habit to get into, to just go, that moves.
That idea, if you sort of look back at many projects that might have been deemed unsuccessful, or even products that don't do what they were supposed to do and led to really bad outcomes, then often this everyone knew but nobody said thing comes up. And that's psychological safety. That's the norms and what people believe is normal in a group of people, and no one daring to challenge or feeling safe to raise things. And and go on, there's a load of psychological studies and concepts like groupthink around how when you set these conditions, then you bring new people in and suddenly they coalesce as well, and you sort of move towards certain failure. But you all know, but no one's doing anything.
It's a really interesting point, and psychological safety you've brought up there. It's crucial to enable that environment to have the confidence to raise things, particularly if there are issues early on, and it's enabling people to raise those issues early. You've got to do that. Otherwise, you get to the right end of a chart, of a Gantt chart, and the surprises come up. And leaders will have told me in the past where, we've been trying to facilitate these teams and they want to know these things early. And it's trying to connect that point to the teams to go, you can do this and it's beneficial because we can rework it, or we can do what we need now, or we can find the right people to support. And sometimes that gets lost in organizations, I think.
Yeah, totally. I like David Marquet talks about this in his book, Turn the Ship Around, and subsequent ones. He said if leaders react badly to problems, teams get better at hiding problems. And I love that because it tests the reaction when you hear news that isn't great news. What happens at that point? And if at that point they're emotional events, then we encourage a pattern that is about suppressing things. If, to your point, the leaders you talk to really want to know that stuff, if they're overtly, actively encouraging it and thanking people when it's raised, then it stimulates a different reaction and a different pattern. And that's the spirit of openness in the project.
My mind is continually flicking to the enablers. Things like the transparency elements. If we create that transparency, you can see what things are affecting if there is a consequence. Having that ability to report action and escalation. And when you connect your strategy to action as well, it's really visual and it's really easy to understand. So then it makes it easier to raise those problems.
All those enablers absolutely critical in this context, and it's a system and a cycle, isn't it? As you say, Tom, that they don't guarantee success, but they load the dice in your favor. They encourage some things at the expense of other things. And I think that's important. I think some of the key takeaways as well in this space where we're sort of knitting fog, really, we don't know quite where we're going to go with this. The key principles really is retire risk through learning. So we reduce product and program risk by prioritizing the work that removes the most significant uncertainty first. So we sequence our program in that way. We decide once, so we make decisions based on knowledge. So we create a sequence of decisions that flow without reversal. No one wins when you decide something with all the facts and then you find out that actually a decision later should have been made before yours and now you've got to unpick that stuff. There's this weird space in sort of product development and innovation flow where you've got two things going on. Anyone who's receiving stuff downstream wants you to decide early. And because you're trying to get as much knowledge as you can to make decisions, you want to decide late. So there's this decision sweet spot. And I would say decide at the last responsible moment. And that's, you keep options open as long as you possibly can. But the moment you're potentially hazarding the critical path of the program, you make the decision and you might need to make assumptions at that point. That's real risk. So at that point, what's the activities that can retire that risk as quickly as possible? But you've done that in a way where you haven't hazarded the program schedule. And then the final one, and it sounds mad, but it's a bit of a trope in agile space, but maximize the amount of work not done. And easy to say, but this idea of just do the right work now, not just what people ask for. So without having that sequence that says, this is where we need to focus right now, and therefore this is where we don't need to focus right now, without having that, teams typically start. And like I said before, if there's a high degree of interdependency between teams, which there typically is in this space, they generate work for each other and this snowball happens. You're like, get back to the work that actually needs to be done. And therefore none of this other stuff. And the best work is the work that you don't do.
Absolutely. And it's a hard sell, particularly in teams or programs that have been on a journey for a long period of time, building up that work and have got to a state that they may perceive as mature. But ultimately, you don't know if that is the right work that they're doing or not. And sometimes that it just means that they don't know what it's connecting up towards. And it's a hard thing to then go in and encourage people to just drop work because they'll have a connection to it, right? And it becomes a difficult thing to overcome early on.
Totally. So a really complex space and really tempting to model the work and plan the work and project the plans, but much better to think about what it is. How do you know you're winning? How do you know you're removing risk? How do you know you're learning fast? What needs to be true for that to happen? Difficult.
I think we alluded to it in the last episode, but this is a world that has existed for quite some time, right? The product flow, that lean mindset. But that's not to say that people who are trying to be lean, they're going to face these challenges, aren't they? They're going to face some big hitters, and some of them struggle to overcome them, I think.
Yeah. And typically, you think of any production environment and supply chain. There are loads of supplier-customer relationships in that supply chain, and loads of complexity and variability. So this, again, it's complex, and breaking it down into simple things is helpful. But those simple models will hit complexity. And what do you do then? Do you dogmatically follow the script, or do you dive in to understand that complexity and try and fix the problems? And whilst there are structured approaches for that, which we'll touch on in a bit, I do think there are a number of challenges that manifest, and they're not dissimilar to some of the knowledge flow challenges. So lack of quality at source. So the being unclear on what the specification is. So the number of times I've worked with manufacturers who say, this drawing's not clear, this definition isn't right, I'm not sure how to inspect that, that tolerancing doesn't look right, the quality input isn't sufficient to create the process to robustly produce the product. That's a challenge. I think perpetual inconsistency. So this sort of, we never quite know what we're going to get. We know it's going to be there or thereabouts, but the variability is bigger than the variability that we're able to tolerate. And this might be our manufacturing process is inherently variable compared to the spec, or it might be our process variability is not too bad, but it's centered away from the requirements, i.e., it's consistently producing stuff that doesn't meet the target. So these things are problematic. And I think any system, any production system where you've got these supplier customer relationships, you're going to have bottlenecks and queues. So how do we level flow across the supply chain end to end? And what does that mean in terms of where we need to focus activities to help the overall flow as opposed to going into every individual process and step and trying to focus our efforts there? So a whole bunch of stuff in there that needs to be unpicked. And I think I just have an example on that last one that's just sprung to mind. I was working with a manufacturer who wanted to improve was deploying a total preventive maintenance program. And ultimately, they wanted to increase the uptime of their assets, their machines, so that they're available more often so that they could produce more product. And as part of that, I was walking with a leader on a Go Look See or a Gemba walk, and we were trying to understand the current state. And we talked to the team leader, and he was in front of his team performance board. And the team leader said, really struggling with output in this cell. We're looking to move to a 3-shift working pattern because we just can't do enough. And as he was talking, I was looking at the data behind him on OEE, which is basically overall equipment effectiveness. So it's availability and quality all wrapped into one. And their OEE was 30%. And benchmark good is up in the 80s, 90s. So this is the availability and the quality of this machine to produce what's required has like 70% of opportunity in it. And his focus was to look at can he resource that line in 3 shifts? Not how could we reduce the downtime and improve the quality that's coming from this machine? So these, are we looking in the right place? Are we providing the right solutions to resolve problems? Manifest everywhere in organizations, but the opportunity in product flow is that you typically have more data, you typically are more precise in terms of what needs to be true and when work is finished.
It's a really good example, Keith. And I'm going to ask a question on that. So I would put in that example, I would try to put myself in the shoes of that person who was trying to focus on one solution rather than maybe what we would have proposed. And what do you think would have led them to that point? Because I imagine, people will always feel they're trying to make the right decision based on what they know and what the data they've got. And yeah, what do you think would drive that?
Agency, actually, which sounds like a strange word, it's another A word, that the I think that team leader would know that many of the things required to drive up availability are either with the maintenance department, so outside his team boundary, or with the original equipment manufacturer. It's not necessarily true, but I believe that that team leader would have believed that. And therefore, for that person being a high performing, high accountable person, they will look at what's within their control. And what's within their control is shift patterns and how to use the resource in the most appropriate way. And so that then becomes less about that person because hugely committed, hugely accountable, and more about the system in which they're operating and the questions that they're being asked by their leadership team and what they're raising and what is being picked up and what's being driven. And I think we can be highly accountable, highly motivated, and we can do the wrong things well because they're within our control.
It's a really good way of putting it. And from our perspective as well, that's sometimes it's a really useful way of trying to diagnose that friction points because people will be doing the wrong things well, and it's trying to pin down to the why and the what, or the how can we frame it so that they know that that is the wrong way now to put them in the right direction. So it's something to always consider, I think, when you approach a project that has these problems, has these challenges, because I think people will either through habits or other reasons, they will go through these things. And it's really trying to pinpoint the why to correct that early.
I think that's when it's helpful to look at the bigger system at play and try and look at what's preventing flow through this system and to map those interventions with the agency of the people. So often organizations pass targets down. So, everyone must improve efficiency by X% or whatever. But that's not helpful in that it encourages people to work on the stuff that isn't going to make a difference at the expense of stuff that is. So, yeah, just unpicking some of that stuff. And that's not to disable people, but that's to enable them to focus on the right problem.
And there are ways to unearth those things healthily. Right? You can't go in and just point the finger and say that what someone's doing is wrong. There's fact behind it, there's data behind it, there's reality, and it's trying to focus on that rather than the correction itself, I think. We mentioned psychological safety earlier. There's a really important factor, and I think we alluded to it in the last episodes. But when it comes to team flow, I think the challenges can actually be considerably different to the other flows we've looked at because I think it's more social, it's more people focused, and it's definitely worthwhile us exploring team flow and the challenges associated with that.
Yeah. Yeah. so many consistent patterns, I think, in social interactions. And I sort of reflect on my time outside Project 4 Learning Lab in operational roles where now I've got the gift of looking at other teams. I recognize all of the things that I created as a leader in the teams that I left. It's with a mixture of embarrassment and enlightenment, I suppose.
By all means, you won't be the only one. I reckon build those things right, and then you leave, and you're on the outside looking in with a different perspective and a different way of thinking. And then it's the, "Oh god, why did I do that?" kind of thing, right?
Yeah, it is interesting. It is interesting. So many things. And I think at the core of them is people accepting things or not saying what doesn't sit well with them, or presuming that everyone else understands but you don't. I reckon I had 10 years in my career where I sat in presentations and thought, I'm so stupid. I just don't understand what people are saying. I just don't understand at all. And then after about 10 years, I was confident enough to go, actually, it's just not clear what's being said. It took so long. And I sat with that for a while to say, I'm not going to look stupid now by asking a question because that would mean I don't really understand what's going on. And I think those sorts of things can lead to lots of things that are unchallenged. Either we're misaligned, this misalignment malaise. We all know what success looks like, don't we? Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Everyone will say, yeah, we do. And then if you ask them, what is success here independently, maybe on some sort of online polling thing together, which is a nice little trick. What does success look like? If you've got 6 people, you'll have 12 answers, because 12 different answers.
It's a great method. I'm reflecting on times where we've been involved in projects early, and it's a really good question to ask them. They can be anonymous to answer it, and you will get a bunch of different answers, and that triggers the conversation, right? You have that starting point, and then you begin to converge to something that is reflected with everyone.
Yeah, totally. Totally. But just opening up the space and just having someone who gives the team permission to say, actually, we don't know this, or there's a bit more to do here. It's just needed often because you don't have the same social connections. Or it could manifest as sort of problem postponement or just not raising problems. I think I'm not sure I want to. I'm not sure I'll be able to do that, but I think I'll have another go tomorrow and it'll be fine. I don't need help yet, maybe because I'm not sure I'll get it, and I'm not sure what the consequences are of me raising that I'm not able to achieve this thing. I think that can play into it. Trust. I think the accepting practices, cultures may be a strong word, but accepting things that others do that don't help, so simple ones, turning up late for meetings, leaving early because really busy and got loads of other things, sort of displays that mean that you're not prioritizing the team over other things, other interests. And I think people pick up on that, where is the motivation of these people? Is it to help us to achieve this thing, or is it something else? And I think the psychological safety aspect, you'll know whether that's present in the team, in that you'll be able to see it really quickly. And then if no one's raising it as an observation or a challenge, they've either checked out, their standards are very low, or they lack belief that there's ever going to be a change, or they're afraid of the consequence of raising it. One of those things. It's really interesting, I think, that you can see people put up with loads of things that aren't ideal, and they know, but they've never had the stimulus to talk about it together, even if they'd willingly talk about it and be very open.
I want to go back to maybe your early comments on team flow. Now that you've maybe been on the outside looking in, and what one change would you want to make now that based on your learning, based on the outside looking in perspective? Is there a big thing that you recognize now in your sort of self-evaluation that you go, if I could go back and do that, it'd be great.
I think in the spirit of you ask me what one thing and I give you two, I'll do the same again.
If I give you two, you'll give me three.
I know. Four, probably. I'll just compound it. It'll be exponential. I think to help teams that I've led look at the bigger picture, the meaning and the impact, the why bit, because it's so easy to get transactional about things. And my learning is that people will tap into the challenge or the opportunity if it aligns, if it's worthwhile to them. And I know that people will work through adversity together if there's something that's worthwhile the other side and they believe it. So that's one. And I think to create the environment where people feel they can speak up, not in the sense of many organizations say, if you see something that's unsafe, speak up, but in the spirit of it's welcomed. And I think for me, there are two things that I reflect on. One is probably because of how I saw myself. One is if people would raise things that weren't right, my first reaction would be to try and suppress that in some way and try and make it all okay. And I think the right reaction is to invite that and thank that and explore what that means. So I think that's important. And I think the second thing I reflect on in the spirit of psychological safety is to not try and convey that I've totally got everything, because I've sort of come to realize that just sort of my insecurities as a leader meant that I felt like I had to show that I'd got it. I've got it all. And when you do that, the danger is that people believe it. And when people believe it, they start to think, well, how come they've got it and I haven't? And I feel like this. And now I can't raise how I'm really feeling because he looks like he's got it all together. So I think that modeling of I I don't know how to I haven't got this. I don't know what this is, and that vulnerability I think is hard to do. But if I look back on now, I think that would be something that I would wish to change, whether I could or not. Someone said to me, and I think it's a brilliant practical device, that when you're presenting a proposal to someone for a way forward or an approach or a new thing, you ask them what's absolutely fantastic about this and what's game changing. And you ask them what's its biggest weakness. That you invite people to indulge in it. What is it about this that could be problematic after you've invited them to talk about why it's so great? And I think the power in that is it gives an invitation to others to both help address that shortfall, but also to model that it's okay to say that there's a weakness in this and we haven't got it all.
There's there's also a real power to allowing people to lay out their assumptions and to address them and not to pat that away. But it's that convergence piece. You can lay everyone's assumptions out on a table and then have a conversation about it. And then you go into which assumptions are right and which ones are wrong and why they're wrong and getting people to the same page in that. And I think it's a really strong thing to do. So when you're asking people about the greats and the bads, enabling that, it triggers the right conversation. It's a real powerful way again of enabling trust. I think if you give them that space to do that without pinning them as wrong, without suppressing that, really powerful.
And I like that idea because that idea of surfacing assumptions, challenging them and removing them is the thing that drives clarity and reduces that worrying burden that teams carry about they're not quite sure what happens when. Someone said to me the other day, and I think it's a nice model, team performance equals potential minus interference. So we have just got to focus on removing interference. And some of that is self-generated, no doubt, through the discussions that I never had. I think finding and fixing problems early is the key. And someone said to me, Are you solving different problems today than you were yesterday? And that's really the key to success, I think. Because if we don't and we find out too late, then there's nothing we can do about it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Flow by Design. If you would like to remove friction in your organisation and find your flow, contact us at info@p4learninglab.com. As part of this podcast series, we are also building up to our conference, Life in Flow Motion, on the 5th of October at the Museum of Making in Derby. To learn more, follow us on LinkedIn and be a part of a community that gathers leaders and explores the art and science of accelerating the flow of work. In the next episode, I will be joined by Mark Thomas, CEO of First Light Fusion, where we navigate the world of future technologies and innovation flow. See you there.